Beverly, great to be with you this morning here from Ann Arbor. And as a former FBI official, as you mentioned, I find this outrageous. It's one thing for people to demand accountability from the FBI and seek answers when it makes mistakes or things don't go well. And that has happened recently over the past few years with the FBI. But this is not an example of that. This is the FBI doing its job like it does day in, day out to keep the United States safe or to investigate crimes. And at no point should FBI personnel feel like they are now under threat from angry Americans. And as you mentioned, somebody went beyond the rhetoric last week and tried to attack an FBI field office in Cincinnati, Ohio, and unfortunately, they paid the price for doing that. So. It's one thing, again, to be upset with the FBI for the right reason, but this is not an example of that. And to act out violently against the FBI, it's beyond the pale, in my opinion.
Yeah, it is. It's so concerning. Do you see any similarities to the anger being whipped up ahead of the January 6th Capitol riots?
There's certainly some interesting parallels there. Now, I think the momentum behind January 6th, as we all know now, was going on for months and months before the actual events of January 6th. This seems more organic because it was the raid now a week ago at Mar-a-Lago at President Trump's residence that triggered this. But there are probably people within this pool now of folks who are angry and upset over the FBI who already had other grievances against the FBI or the federal government or law enforcement. And so this, you add this to that existing set of grievances. But the thing that I think concerns most folks in the national security world, even people like me now on the outside, is the fact there are people apparently willing to act out violently. And that probably was the basis, as you also mentioned, for the bulletin that went out between FBI and DHS late last week.
Yeah. Let's come to the raid itself. From what you've read and understood, do you believe Trump was obstructing the return of these highly sensitive documents?
I think this is one of the fundamental questions to which we don't yet know the answers. And if depending on how the evidence and information emerges with the Department of Justice investigation, if President Trump deliberately violated any of the three statutes that potentially are being, or criminal charges that are potentially being explored right now, then yes, there's a potential liability there. But I think a lot of this will depend on intent and did the intent match the wording of these statutes to actually now bring a charge? The most serious charge is under the Espionage Act. But interestingly, when people think espionage, they think the traditional kind of espionage, cloak and dagger spying, clandestine activity. Whatever is being considered under the Espionage Act doesn't fit into that category. It's more the unauthorized retention of very sensitive government documents. And apparently, based on the search, there were different levels of classified information that were retrieved from that broader search. So that's where the Espionage Act is coming into play, but we don't yet know whether an actual charge will be brought forward.
Yeah, and that's I want to ask you about that in a second. But, what do you make of how credible are the claims that Trump has made that it was established process that anything that went to Mar-a-Lago was declassified? I mean, when you look at some of these documents potentially relating to nuclear weapons, would that be normal that those sorts of documents would be declassified, or anyone would think about removing them?
Well, there's lots of formal process that has to be implemented in order for any former government official to have access to previously classified information. But even as a sitting president, when President Trump was in office, he couldn't just unilaterally and verbally declare whatever piece of intelligence had come to him or intelligence assessment had come to him that is now hereby declassified. I mean, that doesn't work like that in our system, and I would know as a former intelligence professional. So normally what would happen is that even if a president wanted something to be declassified, then it has to go through all these rigid steps to actually have it become declassified. And then it would go to the National Archives and potentially back to a president in a presidential library type setting. But the personal retention of these documents, even if they were unclassified through the formal process, that is something that shouldn't happened. So that's another one of these issues that will have to be explored through the investigation. Why did President Trump believe that he had this authority when he was president? And then when he left the presidency, why did he think that he could take these documents?
Yeah, and whether there's any form of paper trail to suggest that they were declassified in any way. Let's come back to the possibility of charges. There's boxes and boxes of documents that I imagine would take some time to go through. But given the political tinderbox that this could be, you know, raiding a former president, a man that clearly seems to want to run again, how delicate is this whole operation for the FBI?
Yeah, I mean, it has to be incredibly delicate. I can't even imagine the pressure that the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, was under, FBI Director Wray, and the two of them must have had to think through the implications of bringing charges or executing the search warrant and then potentially considering charges or not. And on either side of that, there were probably pros and cons. But in a perfect world, and hopefully this is how the FBI and the Department of Justice operate, and I saw that the majority of my career, you want to operate with no political bias whatsoever. You go where the investigation takes you based on facts and evidence and intelligence, if that's a part of the puzzle too. But you should, the Bureau and the Department of Justice are not these political tools to be used by any president, whether Democrat or Republican. So I would have to imagine the implications were thought through at the highest level, but at the same time, the search was, the warrant was issued, the search was conducted, documents were recovered, and now potential charges are being considered. And we'll see how that impacts anything on the pure political front with President Trump if he does want to run again in 2024.
Indeed. And, you know, Javed, I'm just interested in all your time as as an intelligence official. Have you ever encountered anything like this?
No, I mean, I think this is unprecedented in our country's history. We've never seen a raid against a former president's residence for the potential unauthorized retention of classified documents. I mean, there's no precedent for that in our country's history. And I think it speaks to the gravity of potentially what is at stake with some of this information that was recovered. And we may never know on the public side the precise details of these different documents at different levels of classification. But again, that must have been the basis for the FBI and the Department of Justice to go forward, because it wasn't like President Trump just took unclassified documents from his personal diary if he kept one. I'm just using that as an example. It was something completely different.
Yeah, it was another level altogether. So appreciate your expertise on this. Thanks so much, Javed.
Absolutely. Thank you, Parmalee.